And sorry,
That was me, sorry.
box pops up saying it's recording. Anyway, so this is going to focus on memoir, and I lead some independent multi-genre creative writing workshops, and so I've worked with people who are writing memoir. I've also published 3 full-length collections of poetry, a chapbook, and also a novella. The novella, I have to, though it's fiction, and there are certainly fictional elements, it really did hew pretty closely to my life. So some of the issues that come up in memoir were live for that book. And also, a great thing about poetry is nobody asks you if it's fiction or nonfiction. Nobody cares. And there's great freedom in that. And so there are many of my poems that are kind of mini memoirs, and there are others that are not. So that's sort of by way of just giving you some idea of why I might have some idea what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do, the way this is going to go, I'm going to talk for a little while, and it'll just be about some of the main challenges I see for writing memoir. And then I'm going to, so that should take, less than half an hour, maybe 25 minutes. And then I'm going to put up for you some questions, and I'm going to invite you to try to answer them. And you don't have to answer all of them, right? What today is kind of taking a stab at answering them. But the idea is that whether you have a finished draft of a memoir, whether there's an idea of a possible memoir that's just simmering in your head, or whether you've started to write some things and you think, well, I don't know, maybe this might be a memoir. The document that you create with some of your answers or draft answers to these questions will give you kind of a clearer idea of what your memoir could be, and also what aspects you have in hand, what you think where you think you're on pretty firm ground, and some others that you might want to develop more. The goal is at whatever stage you are at, your answers will provide you a kind of roadmap of where you can think of going next. And as you go along in the process, if you keep revisiting these questions, some of your answers will change. And you also, some of them that you maybe can't answer right now, you'll be able to answer. And so it's the idea is that you take this through your writing of the memoir, and it can help you get some focus. And it can also be useful. This is way down the road, but when it comes time to describe your project to others or pitch it to an agent or an editor or something like that, you will have developed some of the language through answering these questions that you'll use. So that's the idea. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to actually screen share, and I don't have, and it's not a very fancy screen share, so I don't have, not like the people who did the book publicity. They have all their nice slides and everything. This is going to be pretty basic, but you will, I'll have, I'm going to go ahead and share that as I talk, and then I'll bring up the questions, and you'll have some time to try to answer what you can. So it's great if you have a pen and pencil. And then we'll maybe be able to share some of your answers. We'll see how time goes, and certainly time for questions. So let me get my screen share on here, and hopefully it'll work. Okay. You see that? Okay, as you see, this is not very fancy, but some challenges of memoir. The number one thing I think is organization. And that's because you know a lot, kind of too much. When you're writing fiction, you're always trying to figure things out, but with memoir, you kind of already know the story. And that's a very useful thing, but it can also be a tough thing. because it becomes a question of what do I put in, what do I leave out? And I'll tell you right now, you cannot put in everything. And the analogy I like to use is of a photograph. You know, in a photograph, there's got to be a foreground and a background. And you cannot have, if you have the foreground and the background in the same focus, you will not be able to distinguish anything. So something has to be, you know, the foreground has to be in a different focus than the background. Now, that doesn't mean that a background in a photograph or in a memoir is not important. It just means you're not focusing on it. So that's a really important thing. Sometimes it feels like, well, this is really important, so I have to put it up front. But it can still be important and kind of be in the background. So just something to remember. So deciding, you know, what to put in, what to leave out, where to start, where to end, and what's really important. So that's one of the big ones. The next challenge here, gaps in memory. None of us have perfect recall, or very few of us do, maybe some very gifted people. So we don't remember everything. And the other thing that's really complicated is that we could have experienced something with some other people and they remember it completely differently. I know I have this with my husband all the time. You know, he'll give an account of something and I'll think, boy, that's really wrong. You know, he's got those details, and, you know, then I'll do it and he'll say the same to me. Say, well, you know, that's not right. I want to say, yes, I am right. But the fact is that, you know, that brings up the way in which we fill in. Memory is pieces of things, and we tend to fill the space between the pieces in so that it's more coherent for us. That's how we remember it. So in a sense, remember what neuroscience is showing is that memory is really part fictionalized. So, you know, that's an issue. If you're trying to tell something the way it happened, there may not be a definitive way it happened. So sometimes what you have to do is be true to your memory, but sometimes it's important to acknowledge the limits of that memory and acknowledge what you don't know, or acknowledge where there are contradictions with what somebody else might have experienced. And, you know, if you just think of we've now realized that quote unquote eyewitness testimony, it can often be, inaccurate. So it's just being aware of that is really important. You will have to do as a memoirist what you do in remembering things. You're going to have to kind of fill in some of those details with some plausible fiction, but you can identify it as such. The next thing is the hardening of the narrative arteries, I call that. And that has to do with the previous one. You know, there's stories that you tell about yourself or you're growing up, and probably my guess is you probably have parents who told certain stories when you were growing up. You know, they talk about something you did when you were 3 or you were 5 and you don't remember. And if you do, you don't really think it was they got it quite right. I give that as an example. And I always really hated that when my parents do it. And now that I'm a parent, I do that to my son. I can't help it. I can't help it. But those are kinds of stories that get hardened around events. And they're stories that don't change after a certain point. We've got it. We've got the narrative. You know, it's like the joke that you tell. The comedian has memorized the joke. And what happens is sometimes those stories go unexamined. And they're just taken, and sometimes they're really worth examining. And so a memoirist really has to be willing to try to identify those places where your narrative has kind of hardened and you haven't questioned it, or haven't thought about it in a way other than just sort of entertainment value. Sometimes it's something that you emotionally cling to, but part of the work of the memoir is to look at these narratives and to look at them from a new perspective, to question them at least consider it. And the next one, grinding axes, and it's funny, in the little blurb for this session that I handed in, I said grinding X's, and I meant to change that and I didn't. So in some cases it depends. If you have an X, maybe it might be grinding X's. It might be grinding both axes and X's, but same difference anyway. If there's some things that are kind of a reader can sniff these out, and one of them is self-pity, and another is demonization. You know, if a reader senses that there's some kind of ulterior motive that you have that you're not being open about, you know, I had a really crazy boss, and I think every once in a while, you know, I basically don't want to write about her because I don't want to think about her, but I do concede sometimes she'd be a great character. But you know, if I were a different kind of person, I could say, oh, I'm going to write this tell-all book about my terrible boss. And that's doesn't work unless it's leavened with some other things. And I'm thinking of The Devil Wears Prada, for example, which, you know, there's some other things going for that book. But if you thought she was just gunning for Anna Wintour, I don't know if it would have been as successful as it would be, because most of the time when we see an ulterior motive and the writer isn't fessing up to it, where they're like, now wait a minute, I'm supposed to trust you and you don't even get what you're doing. You're not even being upfront about it. Now, there's another side of this, and that is that your early drafts, you may have to grind some axes or indulge in self-pity. And the big example of that is a wonderful memoir, and if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to read it. It's Andre Dubus III's Townie. And he wrote that after he had written a couple of novels. He already had a pretty big reputation by that time. But he had been writing that book for many years. And he did have some gripes from his childhood, some legitimate gripes. And he writes about how his early drafts of this were just full of self-pity. And, you know, he showed them to friends and they said, you know, this isn't going to fly. You know, it's just not working. And he had to do many drafts. But those early drafts, he had to write those because he had to acknowledge the hurt child in himself. And that was the way he had to do it in order to go on. And then he's, you know, the final version is really not, I mean, he presents all of the pain, but without the self-pity and with a greater understanding and with a kind of compassion for his parents that I don't think, I think he wasn't probably quite capable of in the when he wrote the earlier drafts. So if you have to write through you have to write through your anger, you have to write through your pain, go ahead, write a draft and just let it all go out, you know, and that's just for you. You know, you can show it to somebody if you trust them, and they may say to you, you know, this sounds a little like you're whining. That's how people often put it with self-pity. They say you're whining, you know, or this sounds a little whiny, or I don't know if I like this character, you know, and then, you know, you've got to go back and work on it. And the thing is, it's really worth doing that, I think, because you get something personally. You know, I mentioned with Dubus, you know, I think he got a very good memoir out of it, but he also got something as a human being out of it. And so that's the pot of gold. You know, I mean, when I titled this, The Pot of Gold at the End of the Rainbow, if you really work in memoir, there's a personal there's a kind of personal takeaway that you can get. And you can get this, through writing through other forms too, but it's really especially true with a memoir. So I think there's challenges, but there's great opportunity, and it's an opportunity that goes beyond just, publishing a book or even writing a book. It can spill into all areas of your life. Okay, so that brings us to gaining insight. I already tried to talk to that. Yeah, we're all after that in whatever we're writing, right? But especially here, because in memoirs that are successful for the reader and the writer, there's something to learn or discover in the examination of the past. Something new for the writer to learn about her or himself and the others who have played a role in the story. And I, trot out the note, that old chestnut, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader, which means this goes back to that hardening of the arteries I was talking about. And I'm going to give an example, tell a little tale out of school without a name, of a former student. And she was working on this memoir, and she would bring in chapter after chapter. And it would be kind of, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And there wasn't much, it was just kind of this series of events. So I talked to her about dramatization and pacing, and all kinds of things like that. Didn't help. And it wasn't until later on, she wrote the whole thing and she finished it. And then she decided to move on to other things. So, it took me a while to figure out what was the issue. And I finally got it. It was that she wouldn't examine anything. She knew what she wanted to say, and she said it. But it didn't change from chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 15. It was all like lining up all this evidence for a preconceived conclusion. So there's not a lot to grab you in that. I don't think she learned anything new about herself from writing that. Now, she went on and wrote some other things. So, probably the practice of writing was good. And she wrote and really went into nonfiction. Not everything we write has to be totally successful. But it took me a long time to kind of figure out what the issue was. And that she basically had a bunch of hardened narratives that were put together. Another thing I just say that readers really hate most of all goody two-shoes characters, and that goes to that grinding axes too. Is if you're and ulterior motives, if your true aim is to justify yourself, well, readers really hate that. Because again, it seems like there's a hidden agenda, and they're getting dragged into it. So, if that's going on for you, you want to get that out in your first draft and then go back, and see if you can, what you can do with that. Because readers do expect in a memoir that the writer will not try to pretty him or herself up, not try to make him or herself look so good. We'll try to, you don't have to demonize yourself either, but, there's really a very high bar of emotional honesty that readers hold memoir to. And, in fiction, you can have an unreliable narrator. You can have a narrator who doesn't get a lot of things. In nonfiction, in memoir, it's very hard. You need to make every effort to try to understand as much about yourself and about your past and what you're writing about as you can. A good faith effort. Sure, we all have some blind spots, but the idea is that you recognize them. So readers really vibrate to flawed characters who aren't afraid to show their warts, but are aware of them and maybe have grown by the end of the story. And that can maybe suggest where you want to start and begin, if that's an issue. Okay, how are we doing? All right. So that's gaining insight. You want to hope to get, and the only way to get the real insight that matters is to write into it. It's not like you can preload it. If you know what your insight is now, I can guarantee you, you better come to another one by the end of your, because it's, you know, it really can't be something that you've just thought up ahead of time. You have to discover it, and then your reader will discover it with you. Okay, here's another one: rendering dramatic or traumatic events without sensationalism. And I'm going to give an example that's not in writing here, but I have a friend, and she's been my yoga teacher, who has some opioid addiction in her family. And they collaborated with a filmmaker to have, who filmed them. And it's a wonderful film. It's going to be at the Philadelphia Film Festival. It was in the Woodstock Film Festival, and it won a prize there. That's how I saw it online that way. It's called Our American Family. So I give a little plug in there. But, you know, their bottom line in working with these filmmakers was, okay, we don't want any needles in arms, you know. And so that was like meant, you know, we don't want this sensationalized. You know, showing that the needle in the arm is the ultimate kind of sensationalism. Well, there's versions of that can be done in writing too. And especially if you have a very big dramatic or traumatic event, you know, that kind of, you know, how do you get your arms around it? Sometimes people find it's difficult to write about it directly. And so one way to deal with that and to kind of downplay sensationalism is to think about going in through the back door, through the side way. You know, think about events that are on the periphery of the big event. And sometimes that will give you entry. It gives you emotional entry to material that may be difficult, but it also may be a way for you to find insight. There may be some insight that's hiding in those peripheral moments. And also it can be interesting for a reader too. Sometimes those, I just read I'll give an example here, and this was in Poets and Writers, the recent issue, and it's a article where she writes about writing a memoir, and she did have a very traumatic, dramatic event. And she did have to kind of do a first draft that was just for herself. But what she found was, at the same time, she started to write more about her mother and her childhood and her growing up. And the initial book focused on this one event. And she did send it out to some publishers, and they said, well, you know, we don't want to write a book. We don't think we can sell a book about blank. And what she did was she went back to some of those peripheral narratives and found in there that it wasn't about, you know, this wasn't a piece about abortion. It was a piece about two mothers who had lost children that they didn't want to lose, because their mother had a story about her adopted brother had died. So by looking at her mother's story and kind of braiding it into her own, she was able to enlarge that canvas. So sometimes some of those things from the periphery can help to, you know, dramatize your main event without sensationalism, and can sometimes also yield some perspective on it. A new perspective. And I'd say that's the big thing that she learned there. One of the big things was that there was a parallel in their stories that she had not even realized before. Okay, and here's the other one, reaction from people you care about. And I don't know anybody who writes any kind of personal material that for whom this isn't an issue. In fact, I kind of worry about the person for whom it isn't. Now you can decide that, come hell or high water, you got to write what you got to write, and they just got to lump it. And that's perfectly fine, but you got to think about it. There's also perfectly fine. Sometimes people decide, okay, there's certain things I'm not going to put in. Or I'm going to disguise, or there's a lot of different ways of dealing with this issue. And any one of these challenges could be a whole workshop in itself. So I'm going to give this pretty short shrift, but, it's what I say the most important thing with this is, again, in the early drafts, don't worry about it. Just think of, nobody has to see this except you. You decide who sees it. So that allows you to write it. I think you should always write it. You can make decisions about who sees it or how you present it later, but you don't have to know all that up front. You can know that you worry about it. You can say, I worry about what great Aunt Kate is going to say about chapter 6. And you can just keep that little worry back there. And you say, well, you know what, let's worry about that later. Because when you finish the whole thing, when you've gone through all these stages, it may be less of a problem than you think it is. And then there are also a lot of ways that you can approach that problem. So I'm not going to get into all the ways that you can approach that problem now, but just say, try to decouple that fear from the actual writing, because it's a separate decision. And that makes things a little bit easier there. Okay, so that's just kind of an overview. And you may wonder, why is she doing all this? Well, some of these things relate to some of the questions that you're going to try to answer. And I think you'll see why. So I'm going to say right up front, before I put up the questions, these are tough questions. They're the kind of questions I hate getting. I hate when somebody says, what's your whatever about? I hate that question, but you got to kind of wrestle with it a little bit. They make everybody squirm. So they are not comfortable questions, and you don't have to answer all of them. What I suggest today, and we'll take probably about 10 minutes to give you is to jot down, start with the ones you think you know the answer to. It's just like on the SATs, do the ones you know right away. And you don't have to write in full sentences. You can take notes, you can make little diagrams, whatever's going to be meaningful to you. You can jot down phrases. It's just getting some of the language. And if you sort of feel like, well, this is part of the answer to one of them, but I don't know the rest of the answer, just put that part down. So this is going to be very fragmentary, and it's just for you. Again, you do not have to share this with anybody. I hope you'll take it through. So the answers just have to make sense to you. You got to be able to understand them. Nobody else necessarily does. And then as you go along, you're going to be filling these out again. So here they are after that big preamble. Here's the one. What is your memoir about? What do you know for sure about the story you want to tell? Now, this may be one of the easier ones. What do you know right away off the bat? What don't you know? Do you have any idea of what you don't know? What most puzzles you? What questions do you hope to answer? Now, here's another really tricky one, I know. So you're just taking a stab. What might be a takeaway for a reader? What do you hope a reader might gain from reading your story? And don't be modest here. You can make any claim you want, world peace, whatever. Don't worry about it. Nobody's going to see it. Just anything you think, what pops into your head. What do you hope to gain for yourself? What's in it for you? Because again, memoir has that unique thing where there can really be something in it for you. Whose reaction do you worry about? Probably don't have to say anything more there. Okay, this is the worst question. Why is this story important? Why does it matter? And again, I'll encourage you not to be too modest here. Go ahead and make a really big claim. Who cares? Nobody's going to hold it to you. Nobody's going to see it. But just see if you can. So give you 10 minutes, see what you can do with these. Okay. And then we'll come back.